Welcome back to another episode of the Science of Winning podcast. Today, I want to talk about creativity and how you can become more creative and the science behind creativity. Because if you understand these 5 steps, you can significantly enhance your level of creativity and also help other people do the same as well. I want to share a little bit of a history and background about this because creativity is one of my biggest passions in life. In fact, it was the very first thing that I started to study as a young kid when it came to brain science or sciences. And it started with my grade 6 substitute teacher who came in from Europe and on the chalkboard had written a bunch of words, drew circles around them, and connected them with lines and said, this is a mind map. And when I asked him during break what that concept of a mind map was, he told me to go to the library and look up famous inventors like Leonardo da Vinci and scientists like Einstein. And that's what I did. And I realized a commonality amongst all of these amazingly brilliant and creative people was that they would draw things on paper, draw circles around them, and then connect them with lines. So they were creating the concept of mind map many, many, many decades and centuries ago. And so what does that do? What is that meant to, you can say, imitate? Mind maps are meant to imitate how your brains work and how your brain ideas are connected through neurons. So I highly recommend people use mind maps as a method or as a form to enhance their creativity. In fact, in every area of my life, through university, through school, through the different organizations I worked with, I was always the first person to introduce the concept of mind maps. And I was actually one of the first people in Canada to use mind mapping software. And so this has been a real core principle to creativity for me, and I highly recommend you use it. But let's talk about the 5 pieces or 5 stages of creativity, because this is very important to understand. Yes, there's a science behind it. But before we get into that, let me talk about what the definition of creativity is. I have a little bit of a looser definition of creativity compared to, you can say, the scientific definition of creativity, because the scientific definition of creativity is coming up with something new or novel that has value. I like to broaden that and be a little bit looser, as I mentioned, and just say creating something of value or solving some kind of problem. So I bucket it all within that. So how do you do that? How do you actually become more creative? And the answer is yes, you can be more creative if you practice these steps. When I started to do this in high school, it was absolutely amazing because I was coming up with answers to solutions and problems academically without actually having to be super smart and without actually having to put in hours and hours of study. In fact, kids would ask me, like, how are you able to get straight A's and do this kind of stuff and not study as much? And that is through this concept of creativity and these 5 steps. Number 1, the first step is to prepare, is to know what you are trying to solve, the actual subject you are trying to learn, because it's very important to define that for your brain. You got to give your brain a goal. As I mentioned before, your brain is a goal-driven organ. So you got to prepare. Now, this is where my definition of creativity or the steps differ from the scientific research-based ones, because they have 4 steps, I have 5. The one that I add in here is what we call flood. That's the second step. And flooding is when you flood your brain with a whole bunch of information and data and everything you know about that subject. You are literally consuming and flooding your brain with all this information. Because what that does is it helps the third step. The third step is incubating. The way your brain works is absolutely phenomenal. Once it takes in all this information, it starts to ferment, it starts to create and connect ideas and dots. And that's where the incubation happens. Okay, so your subconscious, or I like to say unconscious brain, is extremely powerful at making connections. And it goes on to the next step, which is step 4. And that is illumination. And illumination is when you have those aha moments, or when those ideas come to light, or when the solution comes to you. And in many cases, yes, that's in the shower, going for a walk. You're doing these other activities, these low cognitive load activities, where all of a sudden your brain says, here's the answer. That's the 4th step, and that's illumination. And then the 5th step is verifying that that idea is actually going to work or going to be creative or find a new solution, whatever that is. So it's a verification of those ideas that are coming to light. Those are the 5 steps. So if you get good at each one of these 5 steps, you can be far more creative. It's phenomenal what you can do. So the first step is preparing, so knowing exactly what you're going after and giving your brain a goal. The second is flooding your brain with information and data. The third is letting that sink and actually incubate in your brain. The fourth then is allowing your brain to actually bring that to light through aha moments and through illumination. And fifth is to actually verify and ensure that those solutions that are coming to light are actually usable. And I would love to hear your feedback. If you try this out in a purposeful and intentional manner, watch what happens to your creativity. It can skyrocket. The caveat to this is you have to give your brain some space. You have to have cognitive capacity to be able to be more creative and not be in cognitive overload. Because if your brain is jam-packed full of information and all these to-dos and on autopilot or stressed out, your creativity significantly drops. So you have to be able to create capacity first. So I'd love to hear your feedback. Please give me some insight in terms of how this worked out for you, because that gives me some tips in terms of what I can change or talk about in the future episodes. All the best.